Okay, so tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the disability community. What motivated you to into the policy realm?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. I think there's a couple different answers to that. I grew up, my dad has a spinal cord injury. And so I think when you grow up in a household where disability is a pretty consistent conversation, and I like to say that I have had kind of just a front row seat to a lot of different accessibility barriers in the world. I think that kind of lights a fire under your butt after a while and you realize like, oh, there's something that can be done about this. So that's kind of my overarching and consistent like why I do this is just to make the world more accessible for families like mine. And I worked for a long time in the outdoor industry and working with folks with a very wide spectrum of disabilities in specifically in the rock climbing space, kind of continued that thought process of like, oh yeah, there's so much that we can do to make the world more accessible. And these things that we deem inaccessible, things like rock climbing or like going outside, can actually be super accessible. We just have to create it. And that creation can be done so often with policy. And so that's what led me to go back to school to study policy and specifically accessibility policy. And now I work in the ADA world. And as a lot of us who are in the kind of disability conversation space, we all know that the ADA has a lot of work to still be done to make sure that it's alive and well and people are being ADA compliant. And so that's what I do. Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So, what are some of the key things that you do in public policy with regards to accessibility and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I work for a local government, and what I do in terms of public policy is kind of two things. One, I want to make sure that um, other agencies and folks who work for local governments and people who work in my community, I want to make sure that they are being ADA compliant. So that's number one. I want to check and make sure specifically that I work with communication policies in the ADA. So, or like programmatic policies in the ADA. So things that aren't like ramps or elevators or those built environment things. I want to make sure that people like know how to call an ASL interpreter and have policies about that and know what their service dog laws are because those are so important and so often overlooked. So I do a lot of compliance, and then I also do a lot of education on policies of like things like service dog laws. 9 out of 10 times if somebody doesn't comply with those, it's because they just didn't know. And so I do a lot of education of like, hey, like let's learn what service dog laws are so that we don't bend the rules in the future a little bit, or like this doesn't come up again. Things like that. So I do, yeah, compliance and education is really where I work in policy.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, what's the process of creating, policy on accessibility? What sort of things do
Yeah.
you consider and what are some of the challenges with creating a policy on accessibility?
Yeah. Um, I think overall, I don't do a ton of policy creation, um, but I think I do like little bits here and there. And I think always the hardest part is that so many people who maybe don't have a loved one with a disability, aren't disabled, just are not really tuned into it. So many people don't realize how diverse disability is. And I think that's the hardest thing is creating accessibility policies. Like the ADA is a great example. The ADA covers everything from folks who are using wheelchairs to people with anxiety disorders or autism. And like those are so vastly different. And like, how do we create a policy that includes everyone with a disability and like make sure that we're not leaving anyone out, but also that we're addressing like the needs of all these different disability communities. I think that's the hardest thing is like people just don't realize how many disabilities exist. And there's so many. So that's the hardest part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what kind of impact does creating policy on accessibility have with people with disabilities and just kind of the community as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good example, or that's a good question. In terms of how good policy impacts the disability community, oh, that's a hard one to answer, especially because I am not a member of the disability community. But I want to, I hope at least when I go to work every day and I'm, doing my job, I hope that the policies that I create and the policies that I uphold can, one, make disability just more visible, especially in the policy space, in the government space, like just consistently, if we have disability policies, accessibility policies, it's, we're starting the conversation and we're increasing those conversations on how important accessibility is. And we're also, policy is really just like a rule book, right? Like we're just writing the rules. And so I hope that if we can create more rules stating like, hey, your program has to be accessible because it's written in a policy, then that, again, we're just continuing on this greater conversation of how we can knock down more accessibility barriers. We're pointing out where accessibility barriers are. Yeah, that's what I hope brings to the disability community. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So like I know there's like a lot of stigma around in the disability community around ableism and stuff like that. So I guess
Mhm.
my question
Yeah.
is, how can like policy sort of tackle, that sort of stigma of like ableism and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think it can tackle it in quite a number of ways. I think speaking specifically from the little corner of policy that I work in, which is communication access and program access, I think or at least I hope that the policies that I'm working with, again, can just address ableism and bring it up in ways that a lot of able-bodied folks just don't think of. Like, for example, this morning I had a conversation on why we should use plain language when we write out like a newsletter or a document, like language that anyone can read. Like the average reading level in the United States is like a ninth grade reading level. Like we don't have to use these really complicated words to get our point across. We can just say it. And that's a huge accessibility barrier as well, right? Like knock it down, like make it readable. And I think when I have conversations like that with a lot of people, especially other people who maybe work in the policy space, they're like, oh wow, I never even thought about that. And I'm like, yeah, like, and that's an ableist kind of mindset, in my opinion, of like, why aren't you thinking about that? And so I hope that just I think policy can lead to the breaking down of, yeah, like ableism, all the different accessibility barriers, because to make good policy, you have to have good education and good conversations around those policies. And so much of ableism is just rooted in like have a conversation about it and learn a bit. Yeah.
Hmm.